What happens when a man, blinded by ego, invites his mistress to a family dinner in the very mansion he once shared with his wife? He expects a smooth transition, a changing of the guard. He expects his powerful mother to approve. But he never expected his mother's definition of loyalty. In one evening, a multi-million-dollar empire is shaken, a life of luxury is upended, and the woman he discarded is given the ultimate power. This is a story of betrayal, hidden motives, and the devastating consequences of underestimating the women you wrong. Get ready, because this dinner is just the beginning. The air in the Blackwood mansion was always thick with the scent of old money and unspoken resentments. It clung to the heavy velvet curtains, seeped into the Persian rugs, and settled like a fine dust on the polished mahogany of the grand dining table. For Ethan Blackwood, this scent was the smell of home, of power, of his birthright. Tonight, however, it felt suffocating, charged with an unfamiliar static. He adjusted the knot of his silk tie, the charcoal grey fabric a stark contrast to the crisp white of his shirt. He was a man sculpted by privilege, with a jawline as sharp as his business acumen and eyes the colour of a stormy sea, currently clouded with a mixture of arrogance and a faint, unacknowledged flicker of apprehension. 6 months? It had been 6 months since the divorce from Dr. Aris Thorne was finalized. 6 months since she had walked out of this very mansion, not with a torrent of tears as he had expected, but with a quiet dignity that had unsettled him more than any screaming match could have. Aris, with her brilliant mind and her compassionate heart, a celebrated pediatric oncologist who saved lives while he acquired companies. They had been the golden couple, a perfect merger of intellect and influence. But perfection, Ethan had found, was dreadfully boring. He craved fire, passion, the thrill of the illicit. He found it in Sienna Miller. Sienna was everything Aris was not. She was a whirlwind of ambition and intoxicating beauty, a PR specialist he'd met at a conference who had made it her mission to conquer his world. Her laughter was loud, her dresses were tight, and her eyes held a predatory gleam that mirrored his own. She was a conquest, a beautiful, glittering prize that made him feel young and virile, a stark contrast to the comfortable, almost fraternal, love he'd shared with Aris in their later years. The divorce had been swift, brutal, and surgically precise, much like the deals Ethan orchestrated. He had been generous, of course, a downtown condo with a spectacular view, a financial settlement that would ensure Aris never had to work again, though he knew she would. Her work was her calling, and a clean break. He had given her everything she was entitled to, and in his mind, that absolved him of all guilt. He had moved on. It was time everyone else did too, which brought him to tonight, the dinner, a simple, intimate affair. Just himself, his mother, Eleanor, and Sienna. It was a necessary step, a formal presentation of the new woman in his life. His mother's approval was not just a courtesy. It was a cornerstone of the Blackwood empire. Eleanor Blackwood, the matriarch, held the purse strings and the final word. She was a woman of formidable intellect and an even more formidable will who had steered the family's wealth through recessions and betrayals with an iron fist clad in a velvet glove. "Everything looks perfect, Mrs. Davies," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous dining room. The table was set for 3, with the family's finest china and silver gleaming under the soft light of the crystal chandelier. The elderly housekeeper, who had been with the family since before Ethan was born, gave a tight-lipped nod. Her eyes, however, held a story of their own. They had seen Aris plan charity galas at this very table, her laughter warming the cold, formal space. Mrs. Davies did not approve, but her disapproval was as silent and starched as her uniform. A sleek black car crunched on the gravel driveway. Ethan's heart gave a slight, traitorous leap. Sienna. He smoothed his suit jacket and walked to the grand foyer, composing his features into a mask of confident charm. Sienna emerged from the car like a movie star stepping onto a red carpet. She wore a crimson dress that hugged her every curve, a bold statement against the muted elegance of the mansion. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect waves, and her smile was dazzling, a weapon she wielded with expert precision. "Ethan, darling," she purred, kissing the air beside his cheek. "This place is magnificent, even more than the pictures." Her eyes roamed the foyer, taking in the sweeping staircase, the ancestral portraits, the sheer, unapologetic scale of the wealth on display. It was a look of hunger, of a predator sizing up its prize. "It's home," Ethan said simply. "Come, Mother is in the drawing room." He led her down the hall, his hand resting on the small of her back. He could feel the tension in her, the nervous energy thrumming beneath the confident facade. This wasn't just a dinner for her, it was an audition. Eleanor Blackwood was seated by the fireplace, a book resting in her lap, though she wasn't reading. She looked up as they entered, her gaze sharp and analytical. She was a handsome woman in her late 60s, her silver hair coiffed perfectly, her posture regal. She wore a simple but exquisitely tailored navy blue dress, adorned only by a string of pearls and the large, formidable diamond of her wedding ring. "Mother," Ethan said, his voice a little too loud. "This is Sienna Miller. Sienna, my mother, Eleanor Blackwood." "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Blackwood," Sienna said, her voice smooth as honey. She extended a perfectly manicured hand. Eleanor looked at the hand for a moment, before slowly, deliberately, extending her own. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "Miss Miller," she said, her voice cool and neutral. Her eyes, the same stormy grey as her son's, did a slow, deliberate sweep of Sienna, from the expensive shoes to the professionally highlighted hair. It was not a glance of welcome, but of appraisal. An appraisal of an asset, or perhaps a liability. "Ethan has told me so much about you," Sienna continued, undeterred. "Your work with the Arts Foundation is truly inspiring." "Is it?" Eleanor replied, withdrawing her hand. "I find it's mostly paperwork and placating egos. Something I'm sure you know a little about, Miss Miller, given your profession." The barb, subtle but sharp, hung in the air. Ethan felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. This was not going to be as simple as he'd hoped. He had expected a certain frostiness, but this was a glacial chill. "Shall we go in for dinner?" he interjected, desperate to move them to the more structured environment of the dining table. As they settled into their seats, the silence was broken only by the clinking of silver against china. The first course was served, a delicate lobster bisque. Sienna, to her credit, navigated the complex array of cutlery with ease, launching into an animated story about a recent PR campaign. She was charming, witty, and beautiful. She was, on paper, a perfect partner for a man of his stature. So why did her presence here feel so jarringly wrong? It was like hanging a garish modern art print in the middle of the Louvre. As Sienna spoke, Ethan's gaze drifted to the fourth place setting. He had explicitly told Mrs. Davies that there would be only 3 for dinner. He shot a questioning look towards the housekeeper, who was standing stoically by the sideboard. She gave a barely perceptible shake of her head, her eyes flicking towards Eleanor. It was his mother's doing. Before he could ask, the sound of the front door opening and closing echoed from the foyer. Heavy, familiar footsteps approached the dining room. Ethan's blood ran cold. He knew those footsteps as well as he knew his own heartbeat. The dining room doors swung open, and there stood Dr. Aris Thorne. She was not dressed for a formal dinner. She wore simple black trousers and a soft cashmere sweater the color of cream. Her dark, curly hair was pulled back in a loose knot, and her face was devoid of makeup. She looked tired, the way a doctor looks after a long, difficult day. But as her eyes met his, they were clear, steady, and held a strength that Sienna's manufactured confidence could never hope to match. She stopped in the doorway, her gaze taking in the scene. Ethan, frozen in his chair. Sienna, her fork halfway to her mouth, her face a mask of confusion and fury. And Eleanor, who looked at Aris, and, for the first time that evening, smiled. A genuine, warm smile. "Aris, darling," Eleanor said, her voice laced with an affection that had been starkly absent just moments before. "Thank you for coming. We were just about to start." The silence that descended upon the dining room was heavier than the ancestral portraits that lined the walls. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of shock, fury, and bewilderment. Ethan felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. He stared at Aris, his ex-wife, standing in the doorway of his family home, looking as though she had simply returned from a long day at the hospital, as was once her routine. But everything was different now. He had made sure of that. Sienna was the first to recover, her PR training kicking in to smooth over the social grenade that had just detonated. She placed her fork down with a delicate clink, her crimson-lacquered nails a stark slash of colour against the white tablecloth. A tight, brittle smile stretched across her lips. "Well, this is a surprise," she said, her voice a carefully modulated purr, though her eyes, fixed on Aris, were chips of ice. "Ethan, you didn't mention we'd have another guest." Ethan couldn't find his voice. His gaze was locked on his mother. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, the picture of serene composure, her expression giving nothing away. This was her move, her game. And he, his mistress, and his ex-wife were merely pieces on her board. Aris, however, seemed unfazed. Her eyes, which held a deep, weary wisdom that always made Ethan feel like a petulant boy, scanned the room and settled on Eleanor. "Eleanor," she said, her voice calm and steady, a soothing balm in the charged atmosphere. "You said it was urgent." "It is," Eleanor replied simply, gesturing to the empty seat beside her, the seat that had always been Aris's. "Please join us." With a quiet grace that felt like a rebuke to Sienna's flamboyant presence, Aris walked to the table. She didn't look at Ethan as she passed, a deliberate omission that stung more than any accusation. She nodded politely at Sienna, a gesture of civility that was somehow more insulting than outright hostility. As she sat, Mrs. Davies materialized at her side, pouring her a glass of water with a familiarity that spoke volumes. "I must apologize for my attire," Aris said, her gaze directed at Eleanor. "I came straight from the hospital. One of my patients, a little boy with neuroblastoma, had a difficult reaction to his latest chemo round." She spoke of life and death matters with a casual gravity that made Sienna's earlier chatter about brand synergy and market penetration seem utterly frivolous. "And how is little Leo now?" Eleanor asked, her tone laced with genuine concern. "Stable for now. We're hopeful," Aris said, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. "He's a fighter." Ethan watched the exchange, a knot of something ugly and unfamiliar tightening in his gut. It was jealousy. He was jealous of the easy intimacy between his mother and his ex-wife, a bond that had clearly outlasted his marriage. They spoke of a world he had no part in, a world of meaning and consequence that made his own pursuits feel hollow. Sienna, sensing the shift in power, tried to reclaim the spotlight. "That sounds incredibly stressful," she said, her voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. "I can't imagine. The pressure must be immense. It reminds me of a crisis campaign we ran for a pharmaceutical client whose new drug had some unexpected side effects. We had to work around the clock to manage the narrative. The comparison was so crass, so breathtakingly tone-deaf, that a stunned silence followed. Iris simply looked at her, her expression unreadable, before taking a slow sip of water. It was Eleanor who responded, her voice as sharp as a scalpel. "I'm not sure managing a corporate narrative is quite the same as managing a child's life, Miss Miller," she said coolly. "But I appreciate the attempt at an analogy." Sienna's face flushed a blotchy red beneath her perfect makeup. She shot a desperate, furious look at Ethan, silently pleading with him to intervene, to defend her. But Ethan was trapped. To defend Sienna would be to align himself against his mother, a strategic error of catastrophic proportions. To remain silent was to abandon his chosen partner, to leave her floundering in the icy waters of his family's disapproval. He chose silence. The main course arrived, a roasted duck with a cherry reduction, a dish Ethan usually loved. Tonight it tasted like ash in his mouth. The meal progressed in a state of excruciating tension. Eleanor and Iris spoke quietly about topics that excluded Ethan and Sienna: the hospital's upcoming charity gala, a new medical research paper, a shared memory of Ethan's late father. They were weaving a cocoon of shared history and mutual respect, leaving him and Sienna on the outside, looking in. Ethan felt a surge of childish anger. This was his house, his dinner. He had orchestrated this evening to formally install Sienna in her rightful place at his side. Instead, he was being made to feel like an intruder, a guest at his own table. His mother was deliberately humiliating him. And for what? To prove a point? He tried to steer the conversation back to his territory. "The Sterling merger is proceeding ahead of schedule," he announced to the table at large. "We're looking at a final valuation that exceeds all initial projections. It's going to be the biggest deal of the year for the firm." He looked at his mother, expecting a nod of approval, a flicker of pride. Instead, she turned to Iris. "Iris, you remember Mr. Sterling, don't you? A dreadful man. We sat with him at that awful fundraiser 2 years ago. He spent the entire evening complaining about his yacht." Iris chuckled, a low, warm sound that filled the room. "The one he named the Alibi?" "Yes, I remember. He told me my work was a cute hobby." Eleanor smiled. "He's a fool. I hope you're taking him to the cleaners, Ethan. Not because it's good business, but on principle. The dismissal of his professional triumph, the casual way they belittled a man he was about to make millions with, was infuriating. They were a united front, a fortress he could not breach. Sienna, meanwhile, had grown increasingly quiet, her earlier vivacity replaced by a sullen pout. She picked at her food, her eyes darting between the other three, a calculator whirring behind her gaze. She was reassessing, reevaluating the prize and the cost of its acquisition. She had likely seen this dinner as the final hurdle, the moment she would be officially welcomed into the dynasty. Instead, she had been relegated to the role of an unwanted, uninteresting interloper. The power she thought she had over Ethan, the power that came from his desire, was proving to be utterly worthless in the face of the real authority in this house. Finally, the ordeal of the main course was over. As the plates were cleared, Eleanor placed her napkin on the table. The gesture felt final, like a judge banging a gavel. "Well," she said, her gaze sweeping over the three of them. "This has been illuminating." She looked at Sienna, her expression one of polite dismissal. "Miss Miller, thank you for coming. I believe you have a clearer understanding of our family dynamic now." It was not a question. She then turned to Ethan, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something that looked like disappointment, a deep, maternal sorrow that cut him more than her anger. "Ethan, we need to talk." Her eyes finally settled on Iris, and her expression softened completely. "And Iris, I have something for you. Eleanor rose from her chair. If you'll all join me in the study. It was a command, not an invitation. As they rose, a sense of dread washed over Ethan. This wasn't just a dinner. It wasn't just a power play. It was a reckoning. And he had a terrible sinking feeling that he was about to pay a price he had never anticipated. The Last Supper was over. Now came the judgment. The study was the heart of the Blackwood Empire, a room that spoke of generations of power and influence. Dark oak paneling lined the walls, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves were filled with leather-bound volumes, and a massive partner's desk stood like an altar in the center of the room. This was Ethan's father's domain, and now it was Eleanor's. Ethan had always felt like a visitor here, a prince waiting for his coronation, but the crown had never quite settled on his head. His mother had never fully relinquished control. Eleanor walked behind the imposing desk, the worn leather of the high-backed chair sighing as she sat. She did not invite anyone else to sit. They stood before her like subjects, awaiting a decree. Ethan, tense and defiant. Sienna, her face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality that barely concealed her simmering rage. And Aris, quiet and watchful, her stillness a stark contrast to the nervous energy radiating from the other two. From a locked drawer in the desk, Eleanor retrieved a single thick folder. She placed it on the polished surface with a soft thud that echoed in the silent room. Her movements were deliberate, imbued with a sense of ceremony. She steepled her fingers, her sharp, intelligent eyes fixing on her son. "Ethan," she began, her voice devoid of its earlier chill, now possessing a weary, almost clinical precision. "For the past year, I have watched you. I watched you grow distant from a wife who was your intellectual and moral superior in every conceivable way. I watched you become infatuated with—" She paused, her gaze flicking to Sienna with dismissive brevity. "A woman who sees you not as a partner, but as a stepping stone, an acquisition. And you, blinded by a midlife crisis of staggering cliché, were too arrogant to see it." Sienna gasped, a small, indignant sound. "Now wait just a minute. You will be silent, Miss Miller," Eleanor cut in, her voice dropping to a lethally quiet register. "You are a guest in this house. For now." Sienna's mouth snapped shut. Her eyes blazed with fury, but she held her tongue. She looked at Ethan, a silent demand for him to defend her honor. Ethan's jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He wanted to rage, to shout, to tell his mother she had no right. But the words died in his throat. He was paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying realization of his own powerlessness. Eleanor returned her attention to Ethan. "I had hoped you would come to your senses, that the divorce would be a shock to your system, a moment for self-reflection. Instead, you doubled down on your folly. You sought to install your mistress in Aris's place, in this house, at my table. You believed that your wealth and your name could simply erase your transgressions, that you could swap out one woman for another as if changing a suit. You have shown a profound lack of judgment, character, and, most importantly, loyalty. Not just to Aris, but to the legacy your father and I built. A legacy built on integrity, not impulse." Each word was a hammer blow, dismantling the facade of the powerful, confident man Ethan believed himself to be. He felt stripped bare, exposed as a foolish, reckless boy in front of his mother, his ex-wife, and the woman he'd chosen over her. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, coiling serpent in his stomach. "What is this, Mother?" he finally managed to say, his voice strained. "A lecture? A public shaming?" "It is a course correction," Eleanor stated calmly. She slid the folder across the desk. It stopped directly in front of Aris. Aris looked down at the folder, then up at Eleanor, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Eleanor, what is this?" "Open it," Eleanor instructed gently. With hesitant fingers, Aris untied the ribbon and opened the folder. Inside was a single, heavy document, filled with dense legal text. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, "Deed of Gift." Ethan's eyes widened. He stepped forward, trying to see the document, a cold dread creeping up his spine. A deed? A deed to what? Aris's eyes scanned the page, her expression shifting from confusion to utter disbelief. She looked up, her mouth slightly agape, and her gaze met Ethan's. In her eyes, he saw not triumph, but a profound and bewildering shock. "This house," Aris whispered, the words barely audible. "The deed. It's for this house." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the frantic pounding of Ethan's heart. It couldn't be. It was impossible. The Blackwood mansion, the ancestral home, the symbol of their dynasty for over a century, was his birthright. It was to be passed down to him, and then to his children, the children he and Aris were supposed to have had. "You're joking," Ethan said, a harsh, disbelieving laugh escaping his lips. "This is some kind of sick joke." "I have never been more serious in my life," Eleanor said, her voice like granite. "The house was mine to give. It was part of my family's estate before I ever married your father. I have held the deed in my name alone for 40 years. And now I am giving it to the person I trust to honor its legacy. I am giving it to Aris." Sienna finally broke. "You can't do that!" she shrieked, her carefully crafted composure shattering into a million pieces. "This is Ethan's house. This was supposed to be our house." The raw, possessive greed in her voice was startlingly ugly. In that moment, all pretense fell away, revealing the transactional nature of her affection. She wasn't fighting for Ethan. She was fighting for the real estate. Eleanor looked at her with something akin to pity. "It was never going to be your house, Miss Miller. You were a temporary diversion. Nothing more." Ethan felt the floor drop out from beneath him. He stumbled back, his hand finding the edge of the desk for support. He stared at Aris, who was still looking at the deed as if it were a venomous snake. This wasn't just about a house. It was a complete and total repudiation of him. His mother had not just chosen Aris over him. She had armed his ex-wife with the ultimate symbol of his failure. She had given Aris the power to evict him from his own life. "Why?" Ethan choked out, the word raw with pain and betrayal. "Why would you do this to me?" Eleanor's stern facade finally cracked, and a deep maternal sadness filled her eyes. "Because you left me no choice, Ethan. You were destroying yourself, and you were tarnishing our name. I did this to save you from yourself. Sometimes a man has to lose everything to understand what is truly of value." She rose from her chair and walked around the desk to stand beside Aris. She placed a gentle hand on Aris's shoulder. "The house is yours, Aris," she said softly, her voice for Aris alone. "Free and clear. There are no conditions. You can live in it, sell it, or burn it to the ground. It is your decision. You are the only one I trust to make the right one." Aris looked from the deed in her hands to the stunned face of her ex-husband, and then to the furious, contorted features of his mistress. She held the power now. All of it. The deed was not just paper and ink. It was justice. It was revenge. It was a burden of unimaginable weight. And in the deafening silence of the study, she had no idea what she was going to do with it. The immediate aftermath was a symphony of chaos conducted in the key of disbelief. The study, once a sanctuary of quiet power, became a pressure cooker of raw, unfiltered emotion. The deed lay on the desk, a silent testament to the bomb Eleanor had just detonated, its legal jargon a death sentence to one life and the bewildering birth of another. Sienna was the first to explode, her shock curdling into a venomous rage. Her carefully constructed persona of the charming, supportive partner disintegrated, revealing the grasping, furious woman beneath. "This is insane! It's theft!" she screamed, her voice shrill and ugly. She rounded on Ethan, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing at his chest. "Are you going to let her do this? Are you just going to stand there and let her give our future to her?" The possessive pronouns, our future, hung in the air, suddenly sounding hollow and transactional. Ethan flinched, not from her touch, but from the raw avarice in her eyes. For the first time, he saw Sienna not through the haze of infatuation, but through the cold, clear lens of his mother's assessment. He saw a woman who had attached herself to his wealth, not his heart. The realization was a sickening jolt, a splash of icy water to the face. "Sienna, stop it," he mumbled, his voice weak, unfamiliar to his own ears. He felt hollowed out, a marionette whose strings had been cut. "Stop it?" she shrieked, her laugh high and hysterical. "You've just been publicly castrated by your own mother, and you're telling me to stop it? She gave your home, your legacy, to the woman you left. Don't you see the humiliation? She's laughing at you. They both are." Sienna's gaze shot to Aris, who was still standing by the desk, the deed held loosely in her hand. Aris looked pale, stunned, as if she'd been struck by lightning. There was no triumph in her expression, no hint of laughter. There was only a profound, overwhelming shock. "And you," Sienna spat at Aris, "don't think I don't see what this is. You played the long game, didn't you? The poor, abandoned wife, cozying up to the lonely old matriarch. You manipulated her." Aris finally looked up, her eyes focusing on Sienna as if seeing her for the first time. The weariness in her expression was replaced by a flash of steel. "You and I are very different, Sienna," Aris said, her voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. "You see a prize to be won. I see a family being destroyed. You think this is about a house. It's not." She looked down at the deed in her hand, her expression one of deep conflict. "I don't know what this is, but it's not a victory." The quiet dignity of her response seemed to infuriate Sienna even more. She turned back to Ethan, her last desperate gambit. "Ethan, fix this. Call your lawyers. Sue her. Do something." But Ethan was no longer listening to Sienna. His world had narrowed to two people, his mother, who stood like a marble statue of judgment, and his ex-wife, who now held the keys to his entire life in her hands. He felt a primal rage building, a desperate need to reclaim his dominance, to reassert his place at the top of the food chain. He pushed past Sienna and confronted his mother. "How could you?" he seethed, his voice low and dangerous. "After everything I've done for this family, for the company. You cut me off at the knees. You humiliate me in front of them. You hand the heart of our family to an outsider." "An outsider?" Eleanor's voice was laced with disbelief. "Aris has been more of a daughter to me for the past 10 years than you have been a son. She has upheld our values while you have trampled them. She saved lives while you collected assets. She's not the outsider here, Ethan. You are." The truth of her words was a physical blow. He had become an outsider in his own home, in his own family. The realization was so profound, so devastating, that his anger momentarily gave way to a vast, empty chasm of despair. He turned his gaze to Aris, a different emotion now swirling in the toxic cocktail of his feelings, a desperate, pathetic plea for understanding. "Aris, you can't accept this. You know it's wrong. This is my home. Aris looked at him, and for a moment he saw a flicker of the old Aris, the woman who had once loved him, the woman whose compassion was as boundless as her intellect. He saw pity in her eyes, and that was worse than her anger. Your home? She repeated softly. Was it my home, Ethan? When you were booking hotel rooms with her? When you were texting her from our bed? Was it my home then? Or was it just a beautifully decorated stage for your life, where I was just another prop? He had no answer. Her words were true, and the truth was a brutal, unforgiving thing. He had desecrated their shared space long before Sienna ever set foot in it. The tension in the room was unbearable. It was Aris who finally broke it. She carefully placed the deed back on the desk, her hands trembling slightly. "I need some air," she said, her voice strained. She looked at Eleanor. I can't think about this right now. This is too much." "Of course, my dear," Eleanor said gently. Aris turned and walked out of the study, her footsteps silent on the thick rug. She didn't look back. The moment she was gone, the fragile truce shattered. Sienna, realizing she had lost, that her investment in Ethan Blackwood had just declared bankruptcy, let out a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. "Fine," she snarled, grabbing her expensive clutch from a side table. "This is a circus. I'm done." She glared at Ethan, her eyes filled with contempt. "When you've grown a spine, you know where to find me. But don't take too long. I have other offers." With that, she stormed out of the study and out of the house. The slam of the front door was a definitive, resounding end to their affair. Ethan knew it, and he was surprised to find that he felt nothing but a hollow, ringing emptiness. He was alone in the study with his mother. The silence was deafening. The deed still lay on the desk, a ticking time bomb between them. "What have you done?" he whispered, the fight gone out of him, replaced by a chilling sense of loss. "I have given you a chance, Ethan," Eleanor said, her voice softening, the hard edges of the matriarch giving way to the sorrow of a mother. "A chance to start over, to rebuild. Not your portfolio, but your character. You have been living in a gilded cage, and you have forgotten how to fly. Or perhaps you never learned." She walked to the window, looking out at the manicured lawns, now shrouded in darkness. "This house, it's a weight. It's a responsibility. It was crushing your father, and it was crushing you. You were so concerned with possessing it that you forgot to live in it." Ethan sank into one of the leather armchairs, the one his father used to sit in. He felt small, insignificant. He had lost his wife, his mistress, and his home in the space of an hour. He had been stripped of everything that defined him. His wealth, his power, his name. They all felt like a costume he had been wearing, and his mother had just ripped it off. He looked at the deed on the desk. Aris had left it. She hadn't taken it. A tiny, irrational flicker of hope ignited within him. Maybe she would refuse it. Maybe she would see this as the cruel, manipulative act it was and reject it out of principle. But as he sat there, in the ruins of his life, another, more terrifying thought emerged. What if she didn't? What if she accepted it? What if, tomorrow, Dr. Aris Thorne, the woman he had betrayed and discarded, became his landlord? The power imbalance, which had so defined his entire life, had been completely, devastatingly inverted. And he had no idea how to live in a world where he was not in control. The days that followed the dinner were steeped in a new kind of silence. The old silence of the Blackwood mansion had been one of oppressive formality and unspoken rules. This new silence was one of absence and uncertainty. It was the silence of a vacuum, a space where a life had been violently ripped out, and nothing had yet rushed in to fill the void. Ethan remained in the mansion, a ghost haunting the halls of his own former kingdom. He had half expected Aris to arrive with a lawyer and an eviction notice the very next day. He had braced himself for it, rehearsing speeches of righteous indignation in his head. But she never came. She didn't call. She didn't text. The deed remained in the study, a potent symbol of her power, yet she refused to wield it. Her inaction was a form of psychological warfare more effective than any legal maneuver. It left him in a state of suspended animation, unable to move forward, unable to go back. His mother, too, had retreated. She kept to her wing of the house, their paths crossing only occasionally in the vast, empty corridors. There were no more lectures, no more confrontations. She had fired her shot, and now she was waiting, observing, letting the consequences of her actions unfold. Her silence was one of patient expectation, and it unnerved Ethan more than her anger. Stripped of his usual distractions, the thrill of the deal, the ego-stroking presence of Sienna, Ethan was left with nothing but time and the echoing silence of his own thoughts. He wandered the house like a caged animal, from the grand ballroom where he and Iris had hosted their first charity gala, to the sun-drenched breakfast nook where she used to read medical journals on Sunday mornings. Every room held a memory of the life he had systematically dismantled. He found himself thinking about Iris, not as the wronged ex-wife or the new owner of his home, but as the woman he had once known. He remembered her passion for her work, the way her eyes would light up when she talked about a breakthrough in a patient's treatment. He remembered her quiet strength, her unwavering moral compass, her ability to find joy in the smallest things, a rare bird in the garden, the first snowfall of winter, a perfectly brewed cup of tea. These were the parts of her he had found. Comfortable, predictable, and ultimately boring. Now, in their absence, he felt a profound and aching void. One afternoon, driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand, he found himself in her old walk-in closet. It had been cleared out, of course. The racks were empty, the shelves bare, but the scent of her remained, a faint, lingering fragrance of lavender and old books. It was a scent of quiet contentment, a scent he had taken for granted and now desperately missed. On the floor, in a forgotten corner, lay a single, small object, a worn, leather-bound copy of Persuasion by Jane Austen, her favorite novel. He picked it up, the cover soft and supple from years of being read and reread. He opened it, and a small, pressed flower fell out from between the pages, a daisy from the mansion's garden. A memory, sharp and painful, pierced through him. A lazy summer afternoon, years ago, when they were still happy, when he had picked that daisy and tucked it into her hair. The small, simple gesture of love felt like a relic from another lifetime, a testament to a man he no longer was. A wave of self-loathing washed over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. What had he become? He had traded this genuine, quiet love for the cheap, hollow thrill of Sienna's manufactured adoration. His mother was right. He was a fool. Meanwhile, Iris was wrestling with her own silence. The deed sat on her coffee table in her sleek, impersonal downtown condo, a place that had felt like a refuge, but now felt like a waiting room. The document was a source of immense, terrifying power. Her friends, when she'd cautiously told them, were unanimous. "Sell it," her colleague, Maria, had urged. "Take the money and travel the world. Build your own clinic. Make him pay, literally." It was tempting. The thought of liquidating the symbol of her pain and transforming it into something good, something that was entirely hers, was incredibly appealing. She could fund a new research wing at the hospital, create a foundation for the families of her young patients. She could erase the Blackwood name from her life and replace it with her own legacy. But it wasn't that simple. The mansion wasn't just a house to her. It was the place she had put down roots, the place she had naively believed she would build a family. It was the garden where she had planted roses with Ethan's father, a man she had adored. It was the library where she had spent countless hours, finding solace in books when the losses at the hospital became too much to bear. It held memories, both beautiful and painful, that were inextricably woven into the fabric of her life. To sell it felt like selling a part of herself. And then there was Eleanor. Iris knew that giving her the house was not an act of charity. It was a strategic move, a desperate attempt by a mother to save her son from himself. Eleanor had placed an immense burden on her shoulders, trusting her to be the catalyst for Ethan's redemption. It was a trust that Iris felt deeply, but also resented. It was not her job to fix the man who had broken her. After a week of agonizing indecision, she knew she couldn't continue in this limbo. She had to face him. She had to see the house again, not as a memory, but as a reality, as a piece of property she now controlled. She drove to the mansion on a crisp autumn afternoon. The gates, which had once felt so welcoming, now seemed foreboding. She didn't use the key Eleanor had given her, but rang the bell instead. It was Ethan who answered the door. He looked diminished. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a weary uncertainty. He was wearing an old university sweatshirt and jeans, a far cry from his usual bespoke suits. His eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a mixture of fear, hope, and a deep, unsettling vulnerability. "Iris," he said, his voice hoarse. "Ethan," she replied, her tone even. "I think we need to talk." He stepped aside, letting her into the grand foyer. The silence of the house enveloped them. It was no longer his house to welcome her into, nor was it hers to claim. They were two strangers in a place that had once been their shared universe. "I haven't decided what to do," she said, breaking the silence, getting straight to the point. "I know," he said. "The waiting has been difficult." She led the way to the drawing room, the site of their disastrous dinner. She didn't sit, but stood by the large windows, looking out at the gardens. "I came to see the house, to try and figure out what it means to me now." Ethan stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, his hands shoved in his pockets. "And what does it mean to you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Iris turned to face him, her expression serious, searching. "I'm not sure yet. Part of me wants to sell it and never look back. Part of me feels a responsibility to your mother and to your father's memory. And part of me..." She trailed off, her gaze softening with a sadness that was profound. "Part of me remembers the man who picked a daisy and put it in my hair in that garden. I don't know who that man is anymore, Ethan. I don't think you do either." Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't talking about the house anymore. She was talking about him, about the man he had lost somewhere along the way. For the first time in his life, Ethan Blackwood had no strategy, no counteroffer, no clever move to make. He was stripped of all his defenses, standing before the woman he had wronged, who now held all the power. And in that moment of complete vulnerability, a single, terrifying, and yet liberating thought surfaced. He had to find that man again. Not for her, not for his mother, but for himself. "I know," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion he couldn't name. "I want to find him, too." The silence that followed was different again. It was no longer empty or tense. It was fragile, tentative, and held the faintest, most delicate glimmer of a new beginning. The conversation in the drawing room did not magically solve anything. There was no tearful reconciliation, no grand gesture of forgiveness. But it did shift the tectonic plates of their broken relationship. The raw, open wound of betrayal was still there, but the air of hostility had been replaced by a fragile, uncertain truce. Oris left the mansion that day without a decision, but with a new, unsettling clarity. The question was no longer just what to do with the house, but what to do with the man who came with it. She began to visit the mansion more frequently, always during the day, always with a purpose. She told Ethan and herself that she was taking inventory, assessing the property's condition for a potential sale. It was a practical, logical reason that provided a necessary shield for the much more complicated, emotional reality. She walked through the rooms with a clipboard, making notes. But what she was truly documenting were the ghosts of her past and the shadow of a possible future. Ethan, in turn, became a reluctant custodian, a groundskeeper in his own former paradise. He watched her from a distance, giving her space. He saw her in the garden, her fingers gently touching the petals of the roses his father had planted. He saw her in the library, running her hand over the spines of books they had once read together. He saw a woman not gloating over her prize, but mourning a loss. His loss. Their loss. During these visits they began to talk. Not about the deed or the divorce or Sienna. They talked about small things, the leaky faucet in the upstairs guest bath, the family of hawks that had nested in the old oak tree, her work at the hospital, his tentative, clumsy attempts to find a new purpose. He had taken a leave of absence from the firm, a move that had sent shock waves through the financial world. He told her he was re-evaluating, a corporate euphemism for completely and utterly lost. One afternoon, she found him in the vast, state-of-the-art kitchen, attempting to make coffee. He looked so out of place, a captain adrift in his own galley. The man who could command a boardroom of sharks was baffled by a French press. "You're doing it wrong," she said, her voice startling him. "You're scalding the beans." He looked down at the steaming kettle with a frustrated sigh. "I've never had to make my own coffee before." The admission hung in the air, a stark confession of his lifelong privilege. The old Oris might have felt a surge of resentment, but the woman standing there now felt something else, a flicker of pity. He was like a man learning to walk again after a long illness. She walked over, took the kettle from his hand, and began to show him, her movements patient and precise. You have to let the water cool for a minute after it boils, and you pour it slowly in a spiral. Like this, as they stood side by side, their arms brushing, the simple domestic act felt both achingly familiar and entirely new. He was watching her hands, but he was also watching her face, the focused concentration in her eyes. He was seeing her again, not as a symbol of his past or a problem in his present, but as a person. "Thank you," he said when she was done, his voice quiet. "It's just coffee, Ethan," she replied, not unkindly. "No," he said, looking at her directly. "Thank you for not kicking me out." The unspoken question of the deed finally resurfaced, but its power had changed. It was no longer a weapon, but a shared, complicated burden. "I haven't decided what to do," she said honestly. "Every time I think about selling it, I think of your father. He loved this place. And I think of you, a little boy running down these halls." The image caught him off guard. He couldn't remember the last time someone had thought of him as a boy, as someone other than the powerful Ethan Blackwood. A crack appeared in the armor he had worn for so long. "I was a lonely kid," he confessed, the words tasting strange on his tongue. "My father was always working. My mother was always my mother. This house was my only friend. It was the most vulnerable thing he had ever said to her. Iris looked at him, and for the first time, she saw past the arrogant man who had betrayed her and glimpsed the lonely child he had been. It didn't excuse his actions, but it offered a sliver of explanation. His cruelty hadn't been born of malice, but of a deep, profound, emotional immaturity. He had never learned to connect with people, so he had learned to possess things instead. This new, fragile understanding became the foundation for a slow, painful process of rebuilding. Ethan began to change. He started with small things. He learned to cook, his first few attempts disastrous, but he persisted. He started working in the gardens himself, firing the expensive landscaping crew. He found a quiet satisfaction in the physical labor, in nurturing something back to life. He was, in a way, tending to the ruins of his own life. He also started to confront his past. He reached out to people he had wronged in business deals, not with legal settlements, but with genuine apologies. He began reading, not the Wall Street Journal, but the books from the library, the novels Iris had loved, the histories his father had collected. He was trying to understand a world beyond balance sheets and stock prices. He was trying to build a new self from the ground up. He was becoming the architect of his own redemption. Iris watched this transformation with a mixture of skepticism and a reluctant, burgeoning hope. She knew that true change was a slow, arduous process. She was a doctor. She knew that healing was never linear. There were moments when the old Ethan would surface, a flash of arrogance, a flicker of entitlement, and she would retreat, the walls around her heart rebuilding themselves instantly. But then there were other moments. The time he called her, his voice filled with genuine excitement to tell her the hawks had hatched. The afternoon she arrived to find he had successfully repaired the antique grandfather clock in the foyer, something even his father had never managed to do. The day he told her he had set up a blind trust to fund a new pediatric wing at her hospital, using his own personal money, with the sole condition that it be named after a patient she had lost. He had done it anonymously, without fanfare. It was not a grand gesture to win her back. It was an act of quiet atonement. One cool evening, she found him sitting on the back terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. A copy of Persuasion lay on the table beside him. "You're reading it," she said, her voice soft. He looked up, a faint, sad smile on his face. "I'm trying to understand Captain Wentworth," he said. "A man who let pride and anger rob him of 8 years of happiness. A man who almost lost everything because he was too afraid to say what was in his heart." He looked at her, his eyes clear and direct, stripped of all artifice. "I have been a fool, Iris. A blind, arrogant fool. I threw away the most precious thing in my life for nothing. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that I see it now. I see you. And I am so, so sorry." The apology, when it finally came, was not the one she had imagined. It was not dramatic or desperate. It was quiet, simple, and utterly sincere. It was the apology of a man who had finally faced himself. Tears welled in Iris's eyes, tears she had refused to shed for months. They were not tears of sadness, but of a complex, overwhelming catharsis. The anger and resentment she had carried for so long began to dissolve, not into forgiveness, but into a kind of peaceful acceptance. She sat down in the chair opposite him. The deed to the house, the great, unresolved question between them, suddenly seemed like a minor detail. The real question was about the man sitting before her. Could a person truly change? Could a love that had been so thoroughly broken, ever be mended? She didn't have the answers, but as she watched the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon, she realized, for the first time, that she was willing to find out. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Tell me about the hawks," she said. The touch of her hand on his was a spark in the darkness, a fragile connection across a chasm of pain. It was not a promise, not forgiveness, but it was a beginning. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic between them settled into a new, unwritten rhythm. The mansion was no longer a battlefield or a prize. It became a neutral ground, a sanctuary where two broken people were tentatively exploring the possibility of healing. Iris made her decision about the house. It came to her not in a moment of dramatic revelation, but in a quiet moment of clarity, while she was sitting with a terminally ill patient. The little girl, wise beyond her years, had been talking about her dream house, a fantastical place with a slide instead of stairs and a river of chocolate in the backyard. It was a house built not of bricks and mortar, but of joy and imagination. And Iris realized that was what the Blackwood mansion needed to become. Not a monument to a fractured past, but a place of life, healing, and hope. She presented her idea to Ethan and Eleanor one Sunday afternoon. They sat in the sunroom, the light streaming in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, remnants of the old, stagnant life of the house. "I'm not going to sell it," Iris announced, her voice steady and sure, "and I'm not going to live in it. Not as it is." Ethan's heart, which had been cautiously optimistic, sank. He braced himself for the blow. "I want to turn it into something else," she continued, her eyes alight with the passion he remembered from when she spoke of her work. "I want to create the Iris Thorne House, a place for the families of the children at the hospital, a place where they can stay, free of charge, while their children are undergoing long-term treatment. A home away from home, with gardens for them to walk in, a library to escape into, a kitchen big enough for them to cook their own meals. A place of peace and respite in the middle of the worst time of their lives." She looked at them, her gaze challenging, hopeful. "The main house has more than enough room. The east wing can be converted into private family suites. We can use the ballroom for group therapy, for art classes for the siblings. We can make this place useful." The audacity of the idea was breathtaking. To take this symbol of private, exclusionary wealth and turn it into a beacon of communal compassion was a move of such profound moral elegance that Ethan was left speechless. He looked at his mother, expecting her to be horrified at the thought of her ancestral home being turned into what she might consider a glorified boarding house. But Eleanor was smiling. It was a wide, genuine smile of pure, unadulterated pride. She looked at Iris with an expression of such deep admiration it was almost reverent. "That," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion, "is the single best idea I have ever heard. Your father would have loved it." She turned to Ethan. "Well, son, what do you think of Dr. Thorne's proposal?" All eyes were on him. This was a test, a chance to prove that his transformation was real. The old Ethan would have seen the financial folly, the logistical nightmare, the desecration of his heritage. The new Ethan saw only the beauty of it, the rightness of it. "I think," he said slowly, his voice filled with a sincerity that surprised even himself, "that it's a brilliant idea, and I want to help." He looked at Iris. "I want to run it. I'll quit the firm. I'll manage the foundation, oversee the renovations, handle the fundraising. Let me build this with you, Iris. Let me help you create this." It was a plea and a promise. He was offering to lay down the weapons of his old life, his career, his ambition, and pick up the tools to build her dream. He wanted to be a partner in her vision, not just a bystander. Aris studied his face, searching his eyes for any hint of his old self, any sign that this was just another grand gesture, another acquisition. She saw none. She saw only a man desperate to atone, to create meaning out of the wreckage of his past. "Okay, Ethan," she said softly. "Let's build it together." And so began the deconstruction of the Blackwood mansion and the construction of the Aris Thorne house. The project became their shared purpose, a new foundation upon which they could build a different kind of relationship. The heavy velvet curtains were taken down, replaced with light, airy linen that let the sun pour in. The dark, imposing furniture was sold at auction, the proceeds going directly to the new foundation. The walls were painted in warm, cheerful colors. Ethan threw himself into the work with a passion he hadn't felt since his earliest days in business. But this passion was different. It wasn't fueled by ego or greed, but by a genuine desire to create something good. He was a natural leader, his skills in management and finance proving invaluable. But he also learned to listen, to collaborate, to defer to Aris's vision. They worked side by side, poring over architectural plans, interviewing contractors, choosing paint colors. They argued over budgets and timelines, but their disagreements were constructive, not destructive. They were partners. Eleanor watched from the sidelines, a quiet, satisfied observer. She had moved into the guest house on the property, content to cede the main stage. She saw her son changing before her eyes, becoming the man she had always hoped he would be. She had taken a massive gamble, and it had paid off in ways she could never have imagined. One day, months into the renovation, Aris and Ethan stood in the middle of the grand foyer. The floors were covered in drop cloths, the walls were bare plaster, and the air was thick with the smell of sawdust and paint. The crystal chandelier was gone, replaced by a simple, modern fixture. It was a chaotic, beautiful mess. "It's going to work, isn't it?" Ethan said, a note of wonder in his voice. "Yes," Aris replied, a smile on her face. "It is." He looked at her, standing there in her jeans and a paint-splattered t-shirt, her hair tied back in a messy bun, and he felt a surge of love so powerful it almost knocked him off his feet. It was a different love from the one he'd felt before. It wasn't the possessive, youthful infatuation of their early years, nor was it the comfortable, stagnant affection of their later marriage. It was a love born of respect, admiration, and a shared, hard-won grace. It was a love built on a new foundation. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "Aris," he began, his voice thick with emotion. She squeezed his hand, her eyes meeting his. "I know, Ethan," she said softly. "Me too." They didn't need to say the words. The house, in its messy, hopeful transformation, was saying it for them. They had a long way to go. The scars of the past would always be there, a reminder of the pain they had caused each other. But as they stood together in the ruins of their old life, they were no longer looking back. They were looking forward at the new, beautiful thing they were building together. The opening of the Aris Thorne house was a quiet affair, a stark contrast to the lavish, high society galas the Blackwood mansion had once hosted. There were no reporters, no celebrities, just the hospital staff, a few key donors, and the first 3 families who would be calling the house their temporary home. The autumn sun cast a warm, golden glow on the building, which now seemed to breathe a lighter, more welcoming air. Aris stood on the newly built front porch, addressing the small crowd. She spoke not of fundraising goals or architectural details, but of hope, community, and the simple human need for comfort in times of crisis. As she spoke, Ethan stood just behind her, out of the spotlight. He watched her, his heart swelling with a pride that was pure and selfless. This was her vision, her triumph. He was merely a humble contributor. And that was more than enough. After the speeches, they mingled with the guests. Ethan found himself talking to a young father whose 6-year-old daughter was battling leukemia. The man, his eyes hollowed out with fear and exhaustion, spoke of the relief of having a quiet, beautiful place to stay, just minutes from the hospital. "I can cook my daughter her favorite meal tonight," the man said, his voice cracking. "In a real kitchen. You don't know what that means. It's a little piece of normal in the middle of all this chaos." "I'm glad we could help," Ethan said, his own voice thick with emotion. For the first time, he understood wealth not as a measure of power, but as a tool for compassion. The numbers on a balance sheet were meaningless compared to the look of gratitude in this man's eyes. Later, as the evening wound down, he found his mother sitting in the garden, on a bench overlooking the rose bushes. "Your father would be so proud, Ethan," she said, her voice soft. "Not just of this house, but of you." "I couldn't have done it without you, Mother," he said, sitting beside her. "Your intervention, it was brutal, but it was necessary. You saved me." "No, Ethan," she corrected him gently. "I just opened the door. You were the one who had the courage to walk through it. And Aris was the one who showed you the way." Their conversation was interrupted by a sleek, familiar car pulling up the driveway. It was Sienna. Ethan's body tensed. He hadn't seen or spoken to her since the night she'd stormed out. He had no idea why she was here. Sienna got out of the car. She looked different. The flashy, aggressive glamour was gone. She wore a simple, elegant dress, and her makeup was understated. She looked older, more subdued. She approached them cautiously, her eyes on Ethan. "Ethan," she said, her voice quiet. "Can we talk for a minute?" Ethan looked at his mother, who gave a slight nod. He walked with Sienna to a more private corner of the garden. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she began, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. I heard about what you'd done with the house, and I had to see it. It's amazing." "Thank you," he said, his tone neutral. She took a deep breath. "I wanted to apologize, Ethan, for how I acted. That night, I was awful. I showed my true colors and they weren't pretty." She gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "When you lose everything, it gives you a lot of time to think. And I realized I didn't love you. I loved the idea of you, the power, the money. I was so busy trying to conquer your world that I never stopped to think if I even wanted to live in it." She looked him in the eye, and for the first time, he saw not a predator, but a person, flawed and insecure. "I'm sorry for the part I played in your pain, and in Aris's. She's a better woman than I could ever hope to be." The apology was unexpected, and to Ethan's surprise, sincere. He saw that she too had been on a journey of self-discovery. Her loss had forced her to confront her own emptiness, just as his had forced him to confront his. "I appreciate that, Sienna," he said, and he meant it. "I wish you well." "You too," she said. With a final sad smile, she turned and walked back to her car, driving out of his life for good. The final ghost of his past had been laid to rest. He found Aris in the library, now a cozy, welcoming space with comfortable armchairs and reading lamps. She was showing a young girl, the sister of a patient, a book with beautiful illustrations. The girl was laughing, her face alight with joy. He leaned against the doorway, watching them, his heart full. This was it. This was the meaning he had been searching for. It wasn't in a boardroom or on a stock ticker. It was here, in the quiet moments of human connection, in the simple act of bringing comfort to others. When the girl had run off to find her parents, Iris looked up and saw him. She smiled, a warm, easy smile that reached her eyes. "It was a good day," she said. "It was a perfect day," he replied, walking towards her. He stopped in front of her, taking her hands in his. The space between them, once a gaping chasm, was now just a breath. The love he felt for her was a quiet, steady flame, a beacon that had guided him home. "Iris," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I know that the past will always be a part of our story. But I have to ask anyway. Can we have a future? Can we start a new story, right here, in this house we built together?" She looked into his eyes, the stormy grey eyes that she had once loved, then hated, and now loved again, in a new and different way. She saw the lonely boy he had been, the arrogant man he had become, and the good, compassionate man he was now. She saw his journey, his atonement, his redemption. She thought of persuasion, of Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth, of second chances and a love that was deeper and truer for having been lost and found again. "Yes, Ethan," she whispered, her voice filled with all the love and hope in the world. "Yes, let's start our new story." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was not about passion or possession, but about partnership, respect, and a profound, shared grace. It was a kiss that sealed the past and opened the door to the future. In the heart of the house, built on the ashes of their old life. They had come full circle, finding their way back not to what they had been, but to something stronger, truer, and infinitely more beautiful. 1 year later, the Iris Thorne house was thrumming with a quiet, steady rhythm of life. The initial novelty had worn off, replaced by the comfortable hum of routine. Families came and went, their stays marked by the ebb and flow of treatments, of good days and bad days. The house absorbed it all, the tears, the laughter, the whispered late-night conversations, the shared meals in the big, communal kitchen. It had become exactly what Iris had envisioned, a sanctuary, a place of solace. Ethan had found his calling not in the grand gestures of fundraising, but in the small, daily acts of service. He was the one who fixed the broken toaster, who drove a mother to the pharmacy in the middle of the night, who sat with a shell-shocked father in the library, not offering advice, but simply sharing the silence. The residents didn't know he was Ethan Blackwood, the former titan of finance. They just knew him as Ethan, the kind, quiet man who ran the house and always seemed to know what they needed before they asked. He had traded his power suit for a tool belt, his corner office for a small, cluttered desk in what used to be the butler's pantry, and he had never been happier. Iris continued her work at the hospital, but her life was no longer consumed by it. She left her work at the door when she came home each evening, home to the guest house on the property where she and Ethan now lived. Their life together was a quiet architecture of happiness, built on a foundation of shared purpose and mutual respect. They were not the golden couple they had once been. Their life was not a glossy magazine spread. It was real, messy, and infinitely more precious. Their love was not a fiery passion, but a deep, abiding partnership. It was in the way he brought her a cup of tea, just the way she liked it, after a long shift. It was in the way she would listen, really listen, as he talked about his day, celebrating the small victory of a repaired boiler or a child's smile. They had learned to communicate not just with words, but with gestures, with silences, with a shared understanding that had been forged in the crucible of their past. Eleanor, now in her twilight years, was a constant, gentle presence. She spent her afternoons reading to the children in the garden or teaching them to play chess in the sunroom. She had found a new role, not as the formidable matriarch of a dynasty, but as the beloved grandmother of this strange, wonderful, extended family. The hardness in her had softened, replaced by a serene contentment. She had gambled everything on her son's character, and in doing so had not only saved him, but had found her own redemption. One crisp autumn evening, exactly 2 years after that fateful dinner, Ethan and Arius sat on the back terrace of the main house, watching the residents prepare for a small Halloween party. Children in costumes ran across the lawn, their laughter echoing in the twilight. "Do you ever miss it?" Arius asked quietly, her head resting on his shoulder. "The old life, the deals, the power." Ethan thought for a moment, watching a little boy dressed as a superhero chase a girl dressed as a fairy. "No," he said, his voice filled with a certainty that was absolute. "I was playing a game, Arius, a game where you win by accumulating things, but I never felt like I had enough. Now," he gestured to the scene before them, "this is real, this has meaning. I don't own any of this, but I feel richer than I ever have in my life." He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, unwavering love. "I spent so many years trying to build an empire. I didn't realize the only thing worth building was a life. With you." She smiled, her heart full. "We built a good one, Ethan Blackwood." "No," he corrected her, a gentle smile playing on his lips as he kissed the top of her head. "We built a great one. The past was not forgotten. The scars remained, a faint, silvery reminder of the pain they had endured and the lessons they had learned. But they were no longer a source of anger or regret. They were simply a part of their story, the story of how 2 people lost everything, only to find something far more valuable in the ruins. They had learned that true power wasn't in what you owned, but in what you gave away, and that the strongest foundations are not built on wealth or privilege, but on the quiet, resilient, and extraordinary power of love and second chances. And there you have it, a story of how a single dinner, a mother's bold move, and a deed to a house changed everything. It shows us that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what truly matters. What did you think of Eleanor's decision? Was it a cruel punishment or a necessary evil to save her son? And what about Eris? Would you have been as gracious and visionary in her position? This story is a reminder that the consequences of our actions ripple out in ways we can never predict. If you were moved by this journey of betrayal, redemption, and the complex architecture of family, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a story with depth, and don't forget to subscribe for more emotional and thought-provoking novels. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.
Thanks for watching.